It's my honor and privilege to introduce Grant Couch. He'll be speaking on the good news on climate. Grant's a colleague in the Citizens Climate Lobby where we volunteer. He's a fellow Boulder Rotarian, and he's a dear friend. Grant graduated in 1970 from the Colorado School of Mines. He went on to work in Wall Street and had a very successful career, including CEO of Bancor. He retired again to our beautiful state, which is not surprising, where he's volunteering on convincing conservatives to take on the challenge of climate change. Grant volunteers for our PPE committee at the Boulder Rotary Club. He's a multiple Paul Harris Fellow, and he's a founding member of the Centennial 1919 Club. Please give a warm Boulder Rotary welcome to Grant Couch.
Thank you, Merrill. Thank you also for being my manager. Merrill, with others, has helped me find speaking engagements at a number of other Rotary clubs throughout the Denver district. I'd like to be able to say I graduated from the Colorado School of Mines. It's a nice twist. It actually was Lehigh, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. I love being a Rotarian. And I remember coming to my first Rotary clubs with Cass and Mike. And I love three things. The first one is I really, really appreciate the motto, service above self. But what I viscerally appreciate is the ability to stand together with fellow Americans and say the Pledge of Allegiance each week. And I really want to focus on one phrase: one nation under God, indivisible. I also really appreciate the four truths, the four noble tests, I should say. But the first test, is it the truth, is a bit tricky, because it's my opinion that in most cases, what's taken for truth is really just a personal or tribally held opinion. So the title, The Good News on Climate, and I know, guessing that roughly half of the audience might be wondering what in the world could be the good news on climate. But I'm also guessing that close to half of the audience might be wondering, why do we have to talk about climate again? I hope to give you reasons for both, but certainly the answer to the second question, I think, is that in the April edition of the Rotarian, they spoke about why climate is Rotary's business. In any event, when I'm done, I hope you'll see that there is good news going on in two climates. I'm not talking just about the global climate, I'm also going to be talking about the political climate. I want to give you a little personal background, and it's been quite a trip for me as I became an engaged citizen. And I'm going to talk about climate, global and political, in 22 minutes, so I can leave room for questions, so hold on. I was born in West Virginia, and for me, when I see this picture, although I know it might be repulsive to some of you in the audience, what I see is, and what I feel and what I smell is the cozy home being kept warm in the wintertime. What I see is the foundation for the steel that built America. What I also see is the product of honorable jobs, dangerous jobs, but done by honorable people who were working hard to serve their communities and our country. They carry consequences from those jobs, of course, as I think most of you are aware. When I was 5, I moved with my parents from West Virginia to New York, where my father was a chemical engineer. I eventually went on to college, Lehigh University, where I got a mechanical engineering degree, and that may be one reason why when I see a picture like this, I think it's beautiful. It's sort of art to me. But it also reminds me of the importance of fossil fuels and powering the Industrial Revolution, which enhanced and improved the well-being of humanity throughout the world since the Industrial Revolution. Without that, things would be very, very different. Now, certainly there are consequences from those fossil fuels, but I think it's important to always remember that we wouldn't be here if it weren't for them. I also like to look at this because on long road trips from New York back to West Virginia to visit our grandparents, and we'd go past chemical plants like this, and my brother and I, sitting in the back seat, would go, "Oh, it stinks." Dad would say, "Boys, that's just the smell of money." So I went on to get an MBA and really spent my career on Wall Street, finance. And in my last finance job, I had responsibility for scores of traders around the world, and we had risk positions of anywhere between $45 and $50 billion that we had to manage every night, and traded somewhere between $15 and $20 billion each day. Big numbers, big risk. And risk management always comes with a cost. And uncertainty is a constant reality. But uncertainty is no reason not to manage the risk. So what's my point? I naturally see risk embedded in all actions and the need to mitigate them. And this lens of risk management is how as a perspective that I use as I got involved with the climate question. I also want to take the opportunity with this picture of Wall Street to say that I really respect and appreciate our capitalist economic system. We certainly need regulations because unbridled, it can be very dangerous, but with appropriate amount of regulations, it's very, very effective. But my default is to let the market solve problems and let economic decisions be made based on market realities. Okay, back to climate. Notice that we're right there in the center of that beautiful picture. So after I retired, I looked around for something to do with my time, and for some reason, climate called me. And I looked at it as a true agnostic. I didn't know, I wasn't sure. But I spent a number of months, 6 to 9, and really ongoing, studying scientific and economic papers to see, is this really a big deal? And if it is there anything this one guy can do about it? And I came to be convinced, and I use the word convinced, not believe, I came to be convinced that the risk is large and it could be an existential risk. But I also know from my studies that there is tremendous amount of uncertainty in climate models. In my experience in Wall Street with econometric models, which are far less complex, I always like to say about econometric models, they're always right some of the time. And this is true, I'm sure, of these more complex climate models. So I don't know that it's going to be horrible. I don't know if it is horrible when it's going to happen. But I am convinced there is a risk, and if we have a solution that doesn't hurt the economy, that can address this risk, then we should be talking about it. If we're not, it makes no sense to me. I'm not talking about science. I don't think that goes anywhere constructive, but I do have a little science story I like to share. I want to read it because it's science, and I want to make sure that I get it exactly right, being science. A little girl asked her mother, "How did the human race appear?" And the mother answered, "God made Adam and Eve, and they had children, and so was all mankind made." 2 days later, the little girl asked her father the same question. The father answered, "Many years ago, there were monkeys from which the human race evolved." The confused girl returned to her mother and said, "Mom, how is it possible that you told me the human race was created by God and Dad said they developed from monkeys?" The mother answered, "Well, dear, it's very simple. I was talking about my side of the family and your father was talking about his." But let me segue for a second and let this story be a question for your truth. Who suffers the consequence if you're wrong on creationism? And who suffers the consequence if you're wrong on whether or not there's any climate risk? That's a question for you to think about. And if the dire warnings of the climate models do come to pass, what will you tell your children and grandchildren? In the interim, let's hope and pray the scientists are wrong. But as I said, if there is an answer that can address this issue and reduce this risk that doesn't hurt the economy, why aren't we talking about it? So there are other very rational thinkers who lead economic organizations who are concerned about the risk and the cost of climate change. This is economically driven. This basically is our economy. I'm not alone. I want to shift back just briefly to the political climate, which I think everyone in here knows is interwoven with the climate, global climate question. If you can't read the caption in the back of the room, what it says is, your mother and I are separating because I want what's best for the country and your mother doesn't. And how true is this for all of us? And how do we decide what's best for the country? There's a great quote from a guy that I really appreciate who writes for the National Review. His name's David French. Americans are polarized in the worst possible way. Two tribes not so much united by love for their own as hatred for the other. And while we may disagree about whether or not there's warming climate and if there's going to be any consequences and who may have caused it, I don't think there's any debate about who's causing the political global warming. Man. Back to staying with the policy, staying with global climate, is there a policy? Right? What would be the attributes of a good policy? So in my process of studying this, I came up with these 4 points. Obviously, we need to address the issue of greenhouse gas emissions. We need to do it in a way that doesn't hurt and ideally helps the U.S. economy and jobs. Ideally, we offset the regressive nature of higher energy costs as we transition to new sources of energy. And almost more important than the first 3 is it's got to be bipartisan. If we don't do this together, it will not work. We can't forget the China question. And we need to maintain America's global leadership without having to go through an international agreement, which I don't think we could ever get to, even if everyone was well-meaning. So fortunately, there was already an existing nonprofit that was working on a policy that addressed these issues. And, interesting for our group here, it was founded by an award-winning Rotarian by the name of Marshall Saunders. An amazing guy. It is now a group of 120,000 plus members across the country. We're represented in every congressional district. And we train all of our volunteers how to lobby, how to do outreach in a way that's respectful, appreciative of what the other side, your audience has been doing in whatever form. We have no enemies. It's about building relationships and trying to have a conversation that finds a common ground. And it's a single focused group. Carbon fee and dividend. And when I got involved with this group is when I really learned what it was to be an engaged citizen. I had always sort of had this view that off there in DC was this group, Congress, and I couldn't tell the difference between either party. They were all seemed, I don't know. I didn't have a very good opinion of politicians or politics. But as I went through the Hill, and I've had now over 60 lobby meetings, I came to appreciate from every single one of those meetings that the members of Congress and their staff behind closed doors are very respectful of the other side, and they're there to do their best in their opinion for the country. Yes, there are blends of ego and power, some self-service, but they're there to serve the country, one form or another, and they want to get something done. I really appreciate that. And they've got so many people asking for their time. It's not easy when constituents are lined up at their door to go in for another lobby meeting after another lobby meeting. So I'm hopeful from those conversations. So I mentioned carbon fee and dividend. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but it's basically 3 legs put a price on the fuels that generate CO2 and greenhouse gases in general, return all the revenues to American households, and have a ring fence at the edge of the country, tariff adjustments and rebates for exporters so that we don't end up just exporting the greenhouse gases and the jobs and hurting the American economy. It would be self-defeating. I don't think anybody really wants to do that, I hope. So I said good news. What's good news number one? It used to be, at this point in my conversation, I would be able to tell you, in addition to those earlier groups I mentioned, support doing something about climate or are concerned about climate, that behind closed doors, Republican leadership and Republican membership in Congress is concerned about climate. But I'm now very happy to tell you that situation has changed. Look at these quotes. Senator Barrasso, like me, a coal state boy, climate is changing, and we have responsibility to do something about it. Our own Senator Gardner, leaders in the House. These are just three quotes from many that I could give you where congressional Republican leadership is stepping out to talk about this. Now, you may ask why. One reason may be that the polling is showing that the millennials and the younger people in the party are very concerned about climate and want the party to start talking about it. I think that's an important reason, but it may be more importantly driven by the Green New Deal, which has busted open the corner in which our party has painted itself. Our very important Republican Party has painted itself like, hey, we got to do something about it. This has gone too far. Let's talk about what we can do that is a constructive and conservative way to solve this problem. So for whatever reason, they're talking about it. And I am very happy about that. But what's interesting is this isn't really news. It's just coming back after a perhaps too long period away from Republican leadership on the environment. Nixon started the EPA in 70. Reagan did the Montreal Protocol in 88. And look at the title of this act in 1989. 144 co-sponsors. The lead sponsor was a Republican Congresswoman from Rhode Island, and Newt Gingrich was one of the co-sponsors. Global Warming Prevention Act in 1989. In the current Congress, there are a number of bipartisan, bicameral, I like to use the bicameral word. That just means it's both the House and the Senate, but it kind of sounds smart. Many others. And these are, there's not controversial, they're bipartisan, and they all come out of a concern for climate, but there's not a lot of talk about this being addressing climate change. They're just doing it without talking about why they're doing it in many cases. So I think this is very good news on the political front. Very good news. Good news number two. Our policy, like carbon fee and dividend, is actually a bill on the floor with bipartisan support, number 763. These are the details of what it does, just like the carbon fee and dividend with the details a little more specific. Starts off at $15 a ton of CO2, goes up by $10 a ton every year thereafter. Context, $15 a ton on CO2 and gasoline is about 13 cents a gallon. So it's not a body blow, but over 20 years it'll be up to $205 a ton. That's a meaningful move, and it gives people incentive to start, particularly businesses, when they're planning, long-term planning, to start thinking about how better to power their investments in the future. 100% of the dividends go back to American households, and it has that border adjustment I talked about earlier. So 3 general impacts from this bill have been studied by a number of groups. It actually reduces emissions, which of course is the whole point of this exercise. It's good for the people, as I mentioned. I think that's important. It makes it easy for it to be bipartisan. And it's good for the economy. It actually generates jobs and increases the GDP over baseline. So it's not about trying to defend things. And what's important here is I'm concerned about environment. I bet every one of you is too. I'm concerned about the climate. And what's so great is that while I understand, I think all of you do, that energy is the lifeblood of our economy, and our economy is what supports all of our lifestyles, that we don't have to choose between the environment and the economy. we can let the economy be the solution to the environmental problems. Context, that dividend I spoke about, in year 5, it's $3,500 a family. So that means a lot to lower and middle income people. And they can use that any way they want. They can use that to put in better insulation, to double pane their windows, to work towards buying a more fuel efficient car, or put braces on their 16-year-old daughter, or buy a gun, or a bottle of whiskey, or lottery tickets. It's America. They can do what they want with it. We're not telling them what to do, but the higher prices as things go up for energy, they would have that incentive. But as Americans, they're free. They have the liberty to make that choice themselves. The government's not telling them what to do. This bill currently has some substantial support, including the Climate Leadership Council, which is Schultz and Baker led. 3,500 economists, including a number of past secretaries of Treasury, Nobel-winning scientists, economists, are supporting it. There's a group of international corporations, including major oil companies. And what's really encouraging, and I know Dan's part of this, is the Students for Carbon Dividends is a group of college campus political groups led by Republican campus clubs, which is awesome. Support this. So the last bit of good news, and this is where I get a chance to show you my engineering expertise in a second. I learned in this process of being engaged in politics that there's two terms that issues can be labeled as. One's a bridge and one's a wedge. Unfortunately, wedge issues are predominant these days, and there's a number of items you could add to that list that I have there that divides us. And some of these, I think, in my opinion, legitimately do divide people. I mean, there's some fundamental reasons for there to be differences on this based on our worldviews. But CCL, primary message to all our members of Congress, is to turn climate into a bridge as opposed to a wedge issue. Here comes the engineering. So there's the wedge. Take off the bottom part, and you got the keystone of a bridge, right? See how easy that was? And as I said, this is the most important message that we at CCL are giving our members of Congress. As I step towards conclusion, and I want to leave room for plenty of questions, which I hope we'll have, I love these two quotes. The top one from ex-Defense Secretary Mattis addresses the political question. I'm going to read it because it's important. What concerns me most as a military man is not our external adversaries, it's our internal divisiveness. We are dividing into hostile tribes, cheering against each other. All Americans need to recognize that our democracy is an experiment. That can be reversed. It can be reversed. Tribalism must not be allowed to destroy our experiment. And of course, Ronald Reagan, very simple, and I think very true. Preservation of our environment is not a liberal or conservative challenge. It's common sense. So the takeaways, we don't have to choose between a strong economy and a good quality environment. They're not mutually exclusive. The economy can help support and recover the environment. And we're now at a point where we can debate solutions, no longer debate the risk. And I think this is one of the cases where the tribal members haven't caught up with the tribal leaders on our right side of the aisle in terms of understanding the need for right side solutions to this potentially existential risk that we're facing. If we can find those solutions that don't hurt the economy and don't hurt jobs, we should definitely be talking about it. Be an engaged citizen. I have found great joy in owning my country and serving my country, as opposed to just being this disengaged economic unit, as the economists would talk about, enjoying the weather and plodding through life without owning any responsibility to help govern ourselves better. I encourage each of you to do that and talk with your members of Congress. And hopefully, I've given you a reason to talk with others about this, to be a bridge builder. Make politics personal. Make it human. The person in front of you, family, friend, fellow Rotarian, you know they share a concern for America with you. Work together. Find the common ground. And building and maintaining bridges is consistent with our Pledge of Allegiance. One nation, under God, indivisible. Indivisible. I think we've got some work to do, but we Rotarians are the ones that can do that in each of our communities. So how do you get engaged? You can join the Citizen Climate Lobby. That would be awesome if you feel so moved. And if you don't think the solution I'm talking about is a good one, then find another one, or look into it, or just soften your own view about whether or not there's even an issue that should be addressed. Please let Senator Gardner and Senator Bennett and your local MOC know you're concerned about this and you want them to, in the first case, listen to the other side and try to find areas where there's common ground and we can work together. And for those of you in the audience who are conservatives and want to spend a little more personal time on this with me, I would love it. There's my email address. It's a marathon, not a sprint, but we're all in this together. And I'd love to help anybody any way I can. Thank you very much. So, questions. I think I see the first one back there. Don, it's you.
I've spent most of the last 10 years working on this project to get CO2 out of the air, so I've looked at some of the econometrics, including utility ones. The pillar of making a fee and using the revenue that goes back to individuals, $300 a month or so. Of course, you're aware that the utilities will mark up the fees that they have to pay, and that the net return to individuals, particularly in an, if I got it right, not regressive way, would be to charge for electricity commensurate to the return. So there won't be a net positive return to individuals, even if you set them $300 or $400 a month.
Thanks. In fact,
the question is there?
Yeah, there is. I mean, I appreciate the question. And I think to rephrase it, what Don's saying is, I don't believe that the dividend would offset the increased energy costs. There are a number done by the Department of Treasury and by right of center and center think tanks who've analyzed the impact of this economically on low and middle income people. And the energy costs do go up. That's what's supposed to happen, so that all economic users of energy, all, as economists would say, all economic units, whether it's residential, commercial, industrial, will use less or have the incentive to use less. But the dividends that go to the American households in these studies show that anywhere from 60 to 75% of the lower income folks, or 60 to 75% of the population, concentrated in the lower income, because it won't offset the costs, increased costs for wealthy people. I have a friend I used to work with on Wall Street whose monthly utility bill for all of his fountains and his gardens and the lights and the zones and his 8,000 square foot house is $4,500 a month. Now that dividend is not going to offset his increase, and it shouldn't. But the lower income people, this will do it. That's what the studies say.
Okay. I guess I have the mic.
Okay.
Thank you. Alexia Parks. I just want to say thank you very much, Grant, because that was an excellent presentation. We all enjoyed it. If you are interested, you asked about, this is one program you have. If you're interested in other programs, I used to write for the Washington Post National Desk. Energy was my beat. I had a national syndicated column on energy and conservation. I worked with Amory Levins. I worked with Dennis Meadows. I worked with people across the spectrum because I was a journalist. But interestingly, the city of Boulder in 1980 funded me to run a conference that we are still running now, and it's available to Rotarians through your groups here. It's an Energy Futures Conference in which, in 1980, the city of Boulder, which I led the event, acted as if we had only 1 year to make a rapid transition to renewables and energy efficiency as their main driver of energy. And that was at the time of the Iranian situation where there was, oil shortages from Iran. We were having a situation in the early 1980s. We're having that also again today. We still have that program available. However, it's now online because what happened in 2007, I was the first accredited blogger for the United Nations on climate change. 2008, the mayor of Des Moines, who's still the mayor, Mayor Frank County, brought me in. They funded me, like the city of Boulder, to run it online. And it's now 20 years later, we're still running it online. I mean, actually, it's more than just 40 years later, and now we have an online component, so we are offering it to Rotary. It can scale around the world. It's based on training facilitators, like in this organization, or within the community, to act as if they have only 1 year, and then you do this incredible planning. That's where the conversations create another bridge for you. So by being bridge builders, you can bridge multiple bridges out from your particular lobbying group, which is obviously very effective. The second one we also got, we were an MIT semifinalist for sustainability2020.org. You can look that up right now. And it's a data collection where students, almost like the old newspaper drives from the 1940s, which some of you may remember, now is online and in person with print documents, both in bilingual, and it can go into homes through students becoming green leaders. And there's 21 questions, and we developed it with a national team of green leaders from the West Coast to the East Coast and all points in between. Thus, we became a finalist. It's also available. So you have multiple additions by just asking me, and we'd be happy to open our files and our programs to Rotary and your organization.
Thank you. I think that local efforts are always wonderful and should be supported. My own focus, though, is on a massive national policy which will help shift the whole system.
Grant, who would collect this money, and who would make sure that it's actually dispersed back to the individuals?
That's a good question, and it's one that comes up often. The simple answer to the first is that the U.S. government, the Treasury, and the different departments that are already taxing and following extraction from the ground, whether it's oil, gas, or coal, and are already tracking everything that gets imported. And in all those cases, there's already levels of tax that are on there. This would just be another effective tax. So it's not a big deal to find out how to source the money. Then the question you ask is a very good one about how do we know, what's going to guarantee that this money goes back to American households? Well, it's dependent upon Congress to write the law that way. One of the things I heard very early was you cannot expect a bag of money to walk down a single block in K Street without it getting mugged. And that's a risk, but it's really one that I'm prepared to take as long as we as constituents tell our members of Congress that this is what we want and this is what has to happen. And if it does happen, that we continue as constituents to get a check each month, then we're going to love our member of Congress that much more. Just like the folks in Alaska don't want to give up their dividend off of their oil and gas extractions up there. They learn to count on it. The people will learn to count on it, and there won't be a very happy politician if he tries to take that away from them. So it's bought a constituency, I think, that keeps it in place. Very important, though. Thank you.
Individuals and families who have been in the coal business and worked in the coal business and fossil fuels for many, many generations, when there's a transition to renewables, that they will have to redefine themselves, and so jobs are so important in terms of their sense of self-worth. Do you have any problem with proposing that the government might play a role in the transition for those people to enable them to transition to new renewable jobs? I haven't heard of any politicians speak of that, but it seems like in the spirit of bridge building, that would be an appropriate role for government to play.
Thanks, Gordon. Yeah, it's a good question, and I personally have no problem with that at all. I mean, coming from West Virginia, I can get teary-eyed about the communities I know that have already been wiped out and are on 100% poverty because of what's happened to coal in the natural course of the market evolution and natural gas and everything else. So there are bills. In fact, there are several other pricing carbon bills on the floor, bipartisan right now, in addition to ours, so it's not the only one. Some of them want to use the funds for infrastructure and supporting transition for fossil fuel communities that are dependent upon this. And it's not just individual communities and individual jobs. Some major infrastructure of our communities, as in schools, are very dependent upon severance taxes and things like that. These all have to be considered, and we all have to be in the solution together. I am reminded, though, of although it will be painful for some people, we have to look at this for the greater good of all of us. And forgive the analogy if it hurts, but when you're addicted to a drug, withdrawal is extremely painful, I'm told. That doesn't mean you're not supposed to do it. We just have to make that withdrawal minimize the pain as much as possible and get the financial equivalent of methadone in place for those who will be suffering. Thank you, Gordon.
Grant, you said you weren't particularly enamored with the notion of international agreements, and you had a schematic up there that showed the U.S. and arrows going back and forth, and I think you used the term a wall to make sure that this problem wasn't just exported somewhere else. Could you explain how you would do that?
Sure, thanks. So the problem with international agreements, I think many of you have had experience in trying to put together a negotiation agreement between two parties. You're going to get 183 with very different perspectives. To come up with something that's actually going to hold, very difficult. When we put in a border adjustment, and yeah, sure, let's call it a wall. You put in a border adjustment that for local manufacturers, U.S. manufacturers, when they send out products that have a large carbon footprint to a country that does not have a comparable price on carbon, they get a rebate from the government to adjust their price so they can compete with those the local manufacturers where they're exporting. And the reverse of that is when we're importing from a country, pick one, that doesn't have a comparable price on carbon, there'll be an extra tariff on that so that our local manufacturers who are abiding by this and working with the solution of putting a price on carbon are trying to compete with imports that don't have the same kind of cost. The tariff brings it back up so that we don't have that problem. So it's a way to economically adjust it. No regulations, just an economic adjustment that levels the playing field while the rest of the world really has no choice but to follow us. We don't have to have an agreement. You want to ship to the U.S., then put a price on carbon. Keep the money yourself, or we'll collect it at our border. Yes?
Grant, I am not the responder. I actually have either a comment or a question here. Two things that came to mind that I find picking up on what Gordon said almost in a way I think tie together. My first question was, I took issue when you made a comment about, we have to make changes as long as it doesn't hurt the economy. Well, the reality is the impact of climate change is having awful effects on the economy, not equally distributed. So the statement needs more nuance. Yes, we may have to do some things that are going to hurt sectors of the economy in order to avoid catastrophes in other parts, and sometime I'd love to have that expanded on. And then the other is a simple question about leadership. When people make a statement, climate change is a hoax perpetrated by the other party, when do we hold leaders to be required to stand up, become informed, and not make statements, but really lead? Say, talk to their constituency and say, here's the impact. Here's what's going to happen in our district or our region if these things unfold as the scientists and others would say they do. When will leaders actually step forth and say, I'm going to be a leader here, not just a tribal member?
Paul, thanks. To your first point, I very much appreciate you pointing that out. I have in the past made that point that it's already costing us a lot of money, our lack of addressing this issue. It will continue to cost even more money, actual, like bottom line dollars and cents, but also for us Rotarians, it's going to cost a lot more human suffering, particularly in the areas that we work on and care about throughout the world outside the U.S. So thank you. That's a very important point. Leadership, it's interesting. This has been, like many of the others, a wedge issue. It's been a battle flag or a battle axe, depending on which party you're with. And it's a way to rally your troops. And when you're leading a tribe you want to keep your folks tight, and the way you keep them tight is by creating fear of the other tribe. And it's a challenging evolution. I had the benefit of being able to, my responder stepped up. So I know this is the close, Karen, thanks. I had the benefit of being up at CU yesterday for Republican senator, a state senator from the Western Slope. And it was a battle apparently for CU to find a Republican that would come to this deep blue space to talk about politics. He was very good. I think he made some points that folks in the audience hadn't really thought about. He disagreed on some things too, and science is a bit of a challenge, but it was a very, very good conversation. But he said something that I want to share with you that it gives me hope, but was also like, really? He's talking about, he gets criticized for what he says in the well of the Senate, as he said it. And he said people take things out of context, and sometimes we're in there, and those cameras are up there, and we all respond differently when the cameras are on us. When the cameras aren't on us, we get along, most of us get along real well, and he named a couple of close friends on the Democratic side. And I said to him, because during the question period, I said, well, Senator, why can't you talk to your Democratic colleagues and just decide that when you're in the well, you're going to talk the same way you do when you're outside the well, so the tribes understand that they can actually talk to each other? He said, well, we hope to do a better job next session. So one hopes. Thank you.
Grant, thank you very much for coming and talking to us about CCL. As a CCL member myself, I really appreciate the approach and your keystone that you showed up there, having a laser-focused plan to bring us together and build a bridge on this very important issue for our planet. And in your honor, the Boulder Rotary Club is pleased to contribute 100 doses of the polio vaccine to the Polio Plus Fund, another way to help save our planet. So thank you very, very much for coming today.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you.